All right, welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled, Will Biden Deliver on His Promise to End U.S. Complicity in the War in Yemen? My name is Riedel. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy centered on diplomacy and military restraint. On February 4th, President Biden committed to ending support for offensive Saudi military action in Yemen, as well as offensive arms sales. But there's little evidence that US policy really changed after Biden's speech, as the US continues to sell arms to Saudi and continues to serve the Saudi Air Force. If Biden is serious about fostering a resolution to the violence and humanitarian crisis in Yemen, why has he not pressured the Saudis to lift the blockade? What role can and should the US play given Yemen's complex internal as well as geopolitical dynamics? Which leads to the question, what can and should President Biden do to deliver on his promise and his commitment to end this war in Yemen? To address these questions, we have a wonderful panel with three prominent experts in this field. But before I introduce our panelists, let me just remind you, for all of those of you who are watching this on Zoom, you can participate in this conversation by asking your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And we will try to go to those questions throughout the conversation that we're going to have for the next hour or so. So with no further ado, let me introduce the panelists. First of all, we have Bruce Riedel. Bruce Riedel is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He served 30 years in the CIA, as well as 8 years in the NSC at the White House, serving 4 different presidents. He is the author of 8 books and considered one of Washington's foremost experts on Saudi Arabia. Then we have Radhya al-Mutawakel, who is a prominent Yemeni human rights defender and the chairperson and co-founder of Mwatana. She has worked in the human rights field since 2004, and she has testified about the war in Yemen before the US Congress, the European Parliament, as well as the UN Security Council. She was also on Time's list of 100 most influential people in 2019. And finally, we have the Quincy Institute's own Annelle Sheline, who is a research fellow in the Middle East program here at QI. She is an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East, and she has written extensively about the war in Yemen for The Nation, for Politico, for Foreign Policy, just to name a few publications. So let me get straight to it with a question for Bruce and Radhya on what has changed since Biden came in. On February 4th, as was mentioned, he committed to ending US support for offensive Saudi actions in Yemen, and he pledged to end all offensive weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Yet reports indicate that Saudi airstrikes on Yemen have occurred with almost the same frequency as before. Question I have is, what really has and has not changed since February 4th in terms of US policy towards Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen? Why don't we start with you, Bruce? Bruce.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank the Quincy Institute for holding this panel. Yemen gets far too little attention in the United States, and everything that we can do to focus attention on it is very much commendable. Biden, most importantly, changed American public posture by saying that we were going to end support for offensive military operations. He went a step further. He said he wanted to secure an end to the war as one of his major national security policy initiatives. That is a striking change from the last 2 administrations of the United States, including the one in which he served as vice president. The Barack Obama administration, maybe reluctantly, but we don't have much evidence of that, supported the Saudi decision to start a war in 2015. It supported enthusiastically the UN Security Council, the resolution that was basically endorsed the Saudi war and is remarkably unbalanced in its approach. Only the Russians had the courage to abstain on that vote, noting that it was so terribly unbalanced that it was unlikely to help peace process. I won't say much about the Trump administration. We can all recall that 4 years ago at this point, Donald Trump was on his way to Riyadh for his Joy Fest with Mohammed bin Salman, and that very strange picture standing around the orb with the Saudis and others. So there's a change in public posture that's quite significant. But you're absolutely right. It hasn't been affected by much change in practice. I don't see any evidence at the 6-month mark coming up that U.S. military assistance to the Saudi war effort has changed in any way. Saudi forces continue to bomb targets in Yemen. Most importantly, the Saudis continue to impose a ruinous naval and air blockade on the country, which is a primary cause of the terrible problems of malnutrition and other things that the Yemeni people are facing. A blockade is by definition an offensive military operation. You don't have a blockade as a defensive military operation. We didn't call the blockade of the South in the Civil War a defensive military operation. And US support for the Saudi military is absolutely critical to these operations, most particularly for the Royal Saudi Air Force. About 3/4 of the Royal Saudi Air Force's aircraft are American-made. Without American spare parts, expertise, technical upgrades, munitions, tires, you name it, those planes cannot operate. And if you cut off the flow today, you will literally ground most Saudi aircraft tomorrow. Now, if we got the United Kingdom to come on board, that would be about 100% of Saudi Arabia's Air Force. As we've seen from the New York Times today, it's not just the Royal Saudi Air Force that the United States trains and supplies, it's the Royal Guards, including the murderers of Jamal Khashoggi. The administration, as far as I can see, has done nothing to cut off this. There has been some suspension of future sales, which is a step in the right direction, but is really not much pressure. Now, to be fair, the Houthis are not a bunch of Boy Scouts. They have, in their human rights record is appalling. They also blockade the flow of food and medicine. But we knew that from the beginning. The Houthis make no secret that they don't like us, that they are our enemies. They have been anti-American from the beginning, and especially since the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003. So not much has really changed. Now, we're hearing in the last week or so sporadic reports that some breakthrough is coming. The airport's going to be opened, maybe the seaport at Hadida may be open. I'm hopeful that there's something here. I'm skeptical there's much, but I think we're at the tipping point. If these things don't come forward in the next couple of weeks, we really need to say that the Biden administration's approach so far is a failure, and that we're not going to get to the outcome we want, and that we need a rethink this approach and make the ends and means come far more into coordination with each other.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to get back to you on the last point, but I want to bring Radhya into the conversation first and see, from your perspective on the ground, do you agree with Bruce's assessment? What else can you add to it? And also, in terms of the situation for human rights, has there been any change on that front? You are on mute, Radhya.
Okay, sorry, thank you. It's too early to say that there is a change in the ground. Still, people are suffering from all parties to the conflict. I have to admit that since February, the airstrikes by the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition that targets civilians or civilian objects, it's much less than before. So in one hand, it's good, but in another hand, it just makes me think that this could happen since the beginning. Why thousands of people were killed and injured while they can do keep the war with not targeting civilians. We don't know if this is going to last or not, because the only thing that really can stop Saudis, Emiratis, and Houthis and other parties to the conflict from targeting civilians is accountability mechanisms. Until now, we still didn't see something, very clear from the US pushing for accountability, like trying to push for referring the Yemen situation to the ICC. And then in the September, we will see if they are going to, for example, support having a criminal investigative mechanism, or they will support what is called the GEE. So accountability mechanisms is a very core issue when it comes to human rights violations and civilians, more than anything else. We cannot depend on the political, mood. It's very, difficult for me as a Yemeni citizen to say that the US administration has failed to reach something, because this will, not because they are succeed, it's just because it scares me. So the new approach for the US administration, it's a window of hope. And it's still very early to say it has gone. And I hope it will not. There is still a space for all to push for something. Until now, what is new? It's this political efforts in order to bring, to have a ceasefire, to push towards urgent actions. The United States, they can immediately stop supporting Saudis and Emiratis. They can immediately stop selling weapons to Saudis and Emiratis, but they cannot immediately stop the wars. And when it comes to the blockade and other humanitarian urgent actions, it's not, it's like it's Saudis and Emiratis and Houthis and the Yemeni government and all of them. And they should all be pushed in order to lift their own blockades. For example, Houthis, they have a siege around Taiz. Besides the Saudis and Emiratis, they have their own weight for blockades. So the air and land and seaports should be opened in Yemen, and there should be a very independent, balanced pressure on all parties to the conflict from the US. I believe since the beginning of the war, that the only independent, balanced pressure can make something in Yemen. I hope that the US administration will really end the war and not manage it. Because whoever designed this war designed it in a way that make Yemen divided between armed groups who became like a de facto from Sada in the north to Socotra in the south. So peace means a sustainable peace where Yemenis can get their state again that is dependent on the rule of law and democracy. Rather than that, or keeping the situation as it is, it's just like the war is still going on. The war in Yemen is not only the airstrikes and the ground shelling and the landmines and all other violations. All of these things should be stopped that make the situation much better, but it's much more than that. We need our state back, and it needs a real political effort from the US mainly and all the international community.
Thank you so much, Radhya. And quickly go back to you, Bruce, before I want to bring Annelle into the conversation as well. Radhya says that, if your prediction is true, that in the next couple of weeks, this would be deemed a failure by the Biden administration. This would be the closing of a window of hope the people in Yemen see, because a shift in the American stance, as she explains, would be critical towards bringing forward a new path. Why, in your assessment, has the Biden administration not done anything and only changed its public posture? Some of these things do not seem to be that difficult. You mentioned it here, you have written it elsewhere, that if the US were to simply end the support for the Air Force, it would be grounded. Why has it been so difficult? Is it political? Is it logistical? Is it military? Is it strategic? Is it part of a negotiation strategy not to actually make true on the pledge of ending the support for the war?
Of course, I'm not a member of the Biden administration, sorry. So I can't speak for them, but I can tell you what it appears to me. I think they are surprisingly intimidated by Saudi Arabia. This is a candidate who promised in the last debate that he would treat Mohammed bin Salman, who is the architect of the Saudi war, as a, quote, pariah. Well, that hasn't been the case. Yes, he hasn't called it, but the Secretary of Defense has called him. And John Kerry, the former Secretary of State and currently climate czar, has met with him in Riyadh. But that's not exactly treating him like a pariah. And I think part of that flows from an exaggerated sense of Mohammed bin Salman's position in Saudi Arabia. The administration thinks that the crown prince is going to be there either as crown prince or king for the next 50 years. Well, yes, he's young. That's possible. He could be there for the next 50 years. Is that likely? Given his track record of reckless mistakes, of which the war in Yemen is the prominent example, but not the only one, it seems highly unlikely to me that he's going to last 50 years, or that if he does, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will be here 50 years from now. They should recognize that this is not just occasional aberrant behavior, like when Jamal Khashoggi was, we now know, drugged and then murdered, and then hacked. This is a pattern that continues. It's happened on the Biden administration's watch. If we are to believe the reports that we're hearing from Jordan, the Saudis were involved in a conspiracy to destabilize the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. What could be worse for American foreign policy in the Middle East than for one of our oldest allies to be destabilized and then potentially risk slip over into the West Bank, into Iraq, even back into Saudi Arabia? So I think that the administration has been overly concerned about Saudi attitudes and overly concerned about alienating Mohammed bin Salman. I would suspect that there's also concern here, as there was in the Obama administration, that they don't want the Saudis lobbying against the Iran nuclear deal. My answer to that would be, I doubt that there are very many Americans whose view on the JCPOA is going to be shaped by Saudi Arabia. There's another country in the Middle East that starts with an I who may shape a lot of American views, but it's not the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that's going to shape American views. So to me, that's kind of the non sequitur. What I think the administration needs to do is live up to what it said it was going to do, which is end support for offensive military operations in Yemen, starting with the blockade. I think it should also go back to the United Nations Security Council with a new resolution, lays out a new basis upon which we can look for a negotiated end to the war.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And I know Annelle has written about that. I'm going to go to that as well and dig a little bit deeper into how such a resolution could look like. But I want to first ask you, Annelle, Bruce mentioned that, you know, we have this exaggerated view of the importance of MBS, perhaps the importance of Saudi Arabia as a whole, certainly in the context of the JCPOA. I would strongly agree with Bruce in terms of the influence or lack of influence that the Saudis would have. Seems to me that Saudi Arabia is a textbook example of how blind support for partners in the Middle East not only tends to prolong conflicts, but also entangles the United States in unnecessary conflicts. Bruce mentioned earlier on, we now know that the US trained several of the Saudi operatives that beheaded Jamal Khashoggi. So not only did the Trump administration protect MBS from the consequences, the Biden administration decided not to sanction him, not to treat him as a pariah, but it also turns out that the US helped train these operatives. Not a particularly pretty picture. A similarly confused image emerges in Yemen, where the US used to fight al-Qaeda. That was the top priority, who were opposed by the Houthis as well. And the Houthis were fighting al-Qaeda. Now there are reports that the Saudis are teaming up with al-Qaeda in order to beat back the Houthis. Do we know what we want in Yemen, Annelle? What exactly is the Biden administration trying to accomplish there? What is our priority? Is the priority al-Qaeda due to their threat to the US, or is the priority to simply follow the lead of the Saudis? Annelle.
Thanks, Radhya. Yes, I think just to back up a little bit to this question of US policy towards Yemen, as you said, historically, especially obviously since 9/11, the US has viewed Yemen almost exclusively through this counter-terror lens. And the reason we saw that leading to such dysfunctional outcomes was because former President Ali Abdullah Saleh knew that and used that to his own advantage. He knew that there was al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was operational in Yemen and asked for resources to combat them, and then used those for his own purposes, and then said, oh, al-Qaeda is still here, they're still operational, I need some more resources. And so this didn't only happen in Yemen, this happened in many different contexts. And in general, it signals the fact that for much of the process of the war on terror, the United States was operating as if other countries also saw terrorism as the primary threat, because the United States had organized the majority of our security apparatus was organized around combating terrorism. And yet for many of these countries in the Middle East, which are our security partners and which the United States usually views as acting in partnership with us and ostensibly in support of American interests, many of these are authoritarian states, and their primary interest is to stay in power. The rulers are actually not as threatened by terrorists as they are threatened by political opposition in their own countries, especially that could be democratic, that in theory would in fact be sympathetic to an American audience who would argue, yes, as we saw during the Arab Spring, the notion that these are people who are trying to fight for more representative government in their countries. And yet, unfortunately, what we saw, the dynamic of the war on terror, because the United States was so exclusively focused on countering terrorism, it became quite easy for many of these governments to paint political opposition in their countries as terrorists. Partly because many of them were Islamists, actors who were pushing for a greater role for Islam in public life. And for the average American, it was fairly easy to conflate terrorism and Islamism, unfortunately having to do with just the history of Islamophobia and just a lot of ignorance about Islam among the American public. And so to back all the way back up to Yemen, in general, we did see the whole US approach to Yemen as being completely focused on counterterrorism and not really understanding the fact that if the United States was just going to send in drones and sort of bombing people, you were priming the whole population of Yemen who already, there was not a whole lot of reason for them to feel particularly supportive of the United States given US actions in the region more broadly. But then you sort of created this tinderbox, at which point when the Houthis then seized control of the capital of Sana'a, and then the Saudi-led coalition is then launching this international operation against them, which has American support, the Houthis are able to capitalize on this narrative that they are protecting Yemen from external bombardment. And though, yes, the Houthis engage in horrible human rights abuses against Yemenis, as armed militia groups do in war, they do horrible things, but there are people on the ground in Yemen who don't necessarily want the Houthis to be in charge, but they will fight alongside the Houthis against the Americans or against the Saudis. Because in general, the narrative that the Americans and the Saudis are in cahoots against Yemen, that resonates very strongly with a population who has been subjected to this American policy of just going after terrorism. So the point I would want to make here is just we see these pernicious effects of the war on terror in many different contexts in the Middle East. And even as the United States now is starting to transition away from countering terrorism as sort of our primary MO, countries on the ground are still trying to use that. We see this from the UAE, for example. So just that the United States needs to be aware of these kinds of dynamics, which again, interestingly, parallel a lot of Cold War dynamics, where saying you were fighting communists was a great way to get U.S. support. So we're just seeing the same thing over again.
Interesting. I want to go to you, Radhya. I have a couple of questions about the blockade, but there's a question from the audience that I thought would be good to get a quick reaction from Bruce on, which is Richard Moody says that his studies show that Saudi Air Force is using a large number of Tornado and Typhoon fighters supplied by the UK and Italy. So ending US aerial support will not stop the destruction. The only answer is to pull all US support politically and logistically from Saudi Arabia and to force the Saudis to stop the blockade. What do you think of that? Bruce, you are on mute.
I don't have data on which aircraft platforms the Saudis use, but I would suspect if they are using their British Typhoons more, it is precisely because they know that their mood in Congress is to limit US support for the war. That's a factor I think we need to bring out here. There is a very strong sense in both the Senate and the House that this war is a disaster made, at least in part, in America, going back to Obama and certainly going back to Trump. I completely agree with Annelle's observation that counterterrorism, the boogeyman of al-Qaeda, has been preoccupying Americans for the past 20 years, understandably. We need to move on. We need to move on to a more nuanced approach. And in Yemen, we need to move away from seeing Yemen only as an appendage of Saudi Arabia. I think Radhya made allusion to this. Successive American administrations have not seen Yemen as a country in itself. They've seen Yemen as the little neighbor of Saudi Arabia and what we should follow Saudi policies. If you go back to the Truman administration, sent the first American diplomats in North Yemen. They sent diplomats from Saudi Arabia. The only American administration that has really delinked its Yemen policy from Saudi Arabia was John F. Kennedy. And that was a long time ago. It's time to delink it from terrorism. It's time to delink it from Saudi Arabia. And it's time to use the instruments we have. One of those instruments is military aid and support. I would go a step further. I don't see any reason why American military combat troops need to be in Saudi Arabia anymore. If they're to protect the kingdom against Houthi drones and cruise missiles, they're not doing a particularly good job. If they're there as part of trying to balance Iranian influence in the region, again, I don't see a lot of progress on these fronts. Saudi Arabia has been our partner for 75 years. Good partners tell their other partner when they're drunk driving. Saudi Arabia in Yemen has been drunk driving for 6 years. It's time to tell our Saudi friends to pull over, change drivers, and get out of a war that is costing them a fortune. Iran.
Thank you, Bruce. Perhaps part of the problem has been that we have been a bit drunk as well. Radhya, I want to turn to some of the specifics of the blockade. According to the UN World Food Programme, a Yemeni child dies of hunger every 75 seconds. And Yemen will experience the largest famine in modern history if the Saudi blockade of Yemen is not lifted. Now, Saudi Arabia could not continue the blockade without US support. Yet the Saudis fear that lifting it will end up benefiting the Houthis. But I want to know, from a human rights perspective, how do you see the usage of the blockade as leverage? Is it truly a legitimate negotiating card to be used? Or do we need to, just as much as we need to delink American foreign policy towards Yemen from Saudi Arabia, do we need to delink the blockade from the negotiations? You're on mute, Radhya.
Sorry again. So you said it, I'm a human rights defender, and I will talk from the human rights angle. From a human rights angle, whenever we talk about the violations that led Yemen to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, when we talk about the starvation as a weapon of war, and we keep saying that Yemenis are not starving, Yemenis are being starved, which is true, we cannot talk about only one party to the conflict. It's the coalition, the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition, but it's also Houthis backed by Iran and other parties to the conflict. The war in Yemen, we have this local dimension. It's not civil war, but we have local dimension. We have this regional powers, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and we have the international dimension. So when we talk about any kind of violation that affect civilians in Yemen or the population in Yemen, so it's or about all the attitude that led to the starvation, we will talk about the blockade and airstrikes by the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition, but also we will talk about the siege and the landmines from the Houthis. And we will talk about the denial of humanitarian access from all parties to the conflict. So it's things that is related to people, to the daily life of people, should be taken in a very sensitive way. If it was put in a political frame, then it would never be solved. If we just take it as it is, and there was, as I said before, a very balanced pressure on all parties to the conflict to respect the international humanitarian law, then this will make difference. It will be clear through the coming months if the US were really serious about this new approach regarding having peace in Yemen or stop supporting Saudis and Emiratis, through not through the very direct response from parties to the conflict. This is a war of 7 years until now, and each year has added its own complication, and complications is a common sense in any war. And I still say that peace in Yemen is very possible, but it needs time. So there are things that can we indicate the seriousness from now. It's just having a new resolution. It's one indicator. There should be a new resolution that understands the new situation in Yemen, and then can help all parties to the conflict to be in the table and to have the real map of the conflict in Yemen, and to enhance accountability and also to have pressure and human rights violations, and to put all the urgent actions that has been done by all parties to the conflict, pushing for accountability mechanisms that can be done whether parties to the conflict are listening or not, because it's not in their hands. It's something international. For all the humanitarian issues, it should be one package. If it is not one package, then will not affect Yemenis. If we opened, for example, Sana'a airport with not lifting the siege around Taiz, and if we do both things with not having a very strong pressure on for the denial of humanitarian access along the city, if we didn't talk about the file of detainees and forced disappearance and the salaries, but salaries are a very big issue, and it's not in the hand of one party to the conflict. These things need a very serious talks and negotiations, and it should not be linked to the war itself. I mean, I keep saying that Yemen doesn't have to be the worst humanitarian crisis, even among the war. It happened only because parties to the conflict, they don't care. And there are many things that can be done that make the situation less miserable. So those parties to the conflict should push to care and to make it easier for civilians, even if it happened that the war is still going on and we couldn't have a very direct ceasefire, which should be one of the priorities also.
Very good. Thank you so much, Radhya. And I want to connect that to, you mentioned the UN Security Council resolution, and now Saudi Arabia uses Section 15 of Resolution 2216 to justify its ongoing blockade, despite the fact that the UN established a mechanism to inspect imports to Yemen to prevent, for instance, weaponry coming in from Iran. Why isn't that mechanism enough for the United States? Is it perhaps linked to what Radhya just mentioned, which is that as much as the blockade by the Saudis have been devastating to the Yemeni civilian population, the blockade that the Houthis are pursuing has also been quite devastating to the population? Is that part of the reason why the US has not been sufficiently satisfied with the mechanism of the UN, or is it something else?
Well, I think this gets back to Bruce's point about 2216, which just to say a little bit more about that. So when it was passed by the UN Security Council, and as Bruce said, the Russians abstained. And so moving forward, if the Biden administration were in fact to push for a new resolution, it wouldn't be, the usual spoilers like Russia or China, for example, that the US might expect to push back against it and veto it. Instead, the US would need to convince the UK and France. But that should be possible if Biden was actually serious about moving forward and shifting the dynamics here. But again, just the point being that at the time that it was passed, right after the Saudi-led coalition began its intervention, the Houthis had just recently taken the capital city of Sana'a. And at the time, they were seen as sort of the primary aggressors. And so Section 15, as you said, calls for actually neighboring countries to be involved in supporting the UN mechanism. Because again, it was seen at the time that the Saudi-led coalition was going to very quickly remove the Houthis, and Yemen would be able to restart this process of democratic transition, which had begun after the sort of negotiated removal of Ali Abdullah Saleh from power, which had been supported by the GCC. So again, part of what is, I think, so frustrating, and perhaps this is some of what Radhya was mentioning, was that Yemen had been on this path towards a democratic transition. And so what's so heartbreaking is actors like the Houthis or the Southern Transitional Council, who were initially included in that process, but did not find that their interests were sufficiently met. And so they embraced violence instead of continuing to push for a non-violent, democratic, representative approach to moving towards a new constitution and a new future for what Yemen was going to look like. So again, to get back to what Radhya was saying, all of the incentives have lined up only for those who have the guns and who embrace violence. And there's been no inclusion of groups that don't have guns, such that we are seeing previous groups that perhaps were not armed now taking up arms because they know that this is the only way that they have the seat at the table. Before we got started, we were speaking with Radhya a little bit, and she was saying that, it's really unclear for humanitarian groups what exactly is happening with these international negotiations because they don't have a seat at the table. It's only groups with weapons. So just to get back to this notion that there was this belief that the Houthis were going to be easy to defeat, and Yemen could restart on this path towards its democratic transition. And yet here we are 6 years later, and there's not been a willingness to acknowledge that 2216 at this point is simply perpetuating the conflict, because it does require the Houthis to give up all territory that they acquired since 2014 and to give up their weapons, which in theory would be desirable for all parties to all militias to lay down their weapons, but it's just not realistic because the Houthis see themselves as winning. And so as long as the United States and the Saudis continue to maintain this position, that this maximalist position that the Houthis essentially have to surrender, the Houthis have zero incentive to come to the negotiating table. From their perspective, they're going to get much further, continuing to pursue violence, continuing to assault the city of Ma'arib, and they hope to consolidate their control over Yemen. So all of this just gets back to the fact that the international community needs to understand that although 2216 may have made sense or seemed to make sense, perhaps based on conditions at the time. It is years past the time that we need a new and updated UN Security Council resolution, which delegitimizes foreign involvement. This needs to be returned to the hands of Yemenis. We know from academic literature that civil wars go much longer when they have foreign funders continuing to pour resources in. So we have to get the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran out, and we have to put this process back in the hands of Yemenis. And the Biden administration could be a huge factor in doing that if they were actually serious about this.
Thank you, Annelle. And the question of getting foreign actors out ties it to perhaps what the Biden administration is signaling that it wants to do. We have a question from the audience, Faria al-Muslimi, who argues that perhaps the Biden administration is planning to build more bases in the Middle East or in Saudi Arabia. But it seems to me that, on the contrary, we have a situation in which there's been some clear signals from the Biden administration that it's seeking to dramatically reduce its military presence in the region. You combine that with what appears to be an increasingly likely revival of the JCPOA, and I'm wondering, Bruce and Annelle, if you could tell me, what impact will that context have for the United States' continued role in this conflict in terms of not changing its position, essentially? I mean, the Biden administration has claimed that it wants to end the war. As you told Bruce, it hasn't changed that much. But if it goes forward with reducing its military presence in the region, goes forward with a JCPOA, how will that, if at all, impact its policy on Yemen?
First of all, we definitely should reduce our military footprint in the region. It's hard to remember that up until 1990, the United States footprint in the Middle East was a single ship in Manama, Bahrain, which was our liaison with the Bahrainis. We didn't have bases like we do now in Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. It is only in the last 40 years that our policy in the region has been militarized the way it is. I hope that the Biden administration is moving towards reducing that military profile. It is certainly much larger than any conceivable mission we have on the foreseeable future. I think that, going back into the JCPOA is a no-brainer, to me at least. It is not a solution to the Middle East problems, but it is a solution to the concern of Iran becoming a nuclear weapons state. I will give the administration credit for beginning dialogue with Iran. Iran's not an easy partner to dialogue with, and I think it's going to become a more difficult partner to dialogue with. But we have to face the facts. The Iranians are a substantial presence in the region. And I think one of the few bright areas is that since Biden, we're now beginning to see Iran brought into the conversation about the Yemen problem. And here, Radhya is absolutely right. We need all parties, not just the armed parties, not just the Saudis and the Emiratis, but the Iranians, Hezbollah, all the parties that have some influence here need to be brought into the process. They don't all have to be in the same room at the same time. Many of them won't want to be in the same room at the same time. But now that we have a new United States negotiator, point man for the Yemen war, he should be reaching out and interacting with all of these players. I was struck in listening to Annelle's conversation about UN Security Council Resolution 2216, that she mentioned that we would have to bring the British along. Well, gee whiz, wasn't the President of the United States just in the United Kingdom? Didn't he spend, 4 nights in the UK? Do any of us heard a single report from his meetings in the UK with NATO or the European Union that the subject of Yemen came up? I know that it's not in the NATO communique. I wouldn't expect it to be there, But certainly this subject should have come up in the bilateral meetings between the US and UK, but it doesn't seem to have gotten warranted that much attention. And very, very briefly, I want to address a question that's in the audience Q&A. They asked about what are the Saudis and Emiratis up to in Mafra and Perim Island and Socotra? Well, I think it's pretty obvious what they're up to. They intend to annex these territories. The Saudis have wanted a pipeline to go directly from the kingdom to the Indian Ocean since at least the 1960s. And they have effectively now taken that part of Yemen, and to all extents and purposes, it has now been annexed to the kingdom. Now, American policy is to support the territorial integrity of Yemen. So we shouldn't be allowing them to do this. The Emiratis are doing the same thing with strategic islands, which is a long-standing Emirati policy of trying to establish control of ports and bases in East Africa. Now they're trying to do it in Yemen. Again, this should put down a strong marker that we're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior, and we expect those bases to be dismantled, not at the end of the peace process, but up front, now. So,
Bruce, would Saudi Arabia, would the UAE be able to be doing this unless they felt that they had a tacit green light from Washington to do it? Because as you mentioned, there's not been any objections.
Well, the UAE has a far more clever and thoughtful crown prince than Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Zayed long ago realized that the war in Yemen was a losing effort that was costing more money than it was worth, and he reduced the Emiratis' role. He didn't end it. As I said, they are holding on to some pretty prime pieces of real estate, but he distanced himself. And then he very cleverly, through the so-called Abraham Accords, did what very smart Arab leaders have been doing for a long time, realizing that the road to Washington goes through Jerusalem. And now he's developed a strong relationship with the Israelis. To boot, he's gotten, 50 F-35s promised. The last thing the Middle East needs is the infusion of a new platform of supersonic jet fighters like the F-35. If we think we have an arms race in the Middle East now, wait till you see people reacting to the delivery of F-35s in Abu Dhabi. The Biden administration put that sale not on the back burner, but in the deep freeze for the foreseeable future. But Mohammed bin Zayed has very cleverly figured out how to push America's buttons. And so far, he's getting away with it. And I think all of this calls for a much larger rethink of American foreign policy towards both Saudi Arabia and UAE.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Radhya, I wanted to go to you first to get your reaction to what the Emiratis are doing. I think you mentioned it earlier on with taking these islands and how you see that playing in, because even the Hadi government has opposed this. So I assume this may be something that is playing into the hands of the narrative that the Houthis would like to put forward in terms of claiming Yemeni nationalism. So I would like to, I know it's probably not the top priority, mindful of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen right now, but would like to get your reaction to it, but also give me your reaction to the idea. We have an audience member, Donald Levich, who's saying, is it possible to resolve this problem without the cooperation from Iran? Now, the Iranians clearly have played a role in Yemen in supporting the Houthis. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that much of their influence have been somewhat exaggerated, and that when it comes to them now delivering in terms of thinking we have to go to Iran in order to pull back the Houthis, it will be quite interesting to see if they actually can deliver on that issue. So give me your assessment, both on the role of Iran, the extent of influence that they have and don't have, but also what Yemen as a society, as a people, ultimately will do once this war is over in terms of these islands?
I want to say something. Thank you for this question. In a certain moment, after years of this war, until now, for example, Houthis, for example, let's say controlling 20% of Yemen, most of the population are in the 20%. The coalition were controlling in a certain time, and until now maybe 80% of Yemen. So what happened in this 80% of Yemen? The coalition didn't try to rebuild the state, rebuild the judiciary system, to have a national army. So the United Arab Emirates, in purpose, I don't know if this is clever or not, but it's evil. In purpose, they created armed groups from the scratch. So they didn't want to strengthen the idea of the state, whether through the internationally recognized government or anything. They supported armed groups, and now and then they created the STC, Southern Transitional Justice. From here, I want to say something that the regional powers they are now changing their shape of intervention in Yemen, but this should be very clear to everyone. So the United Arab Emirates, they are not. They are still in Yemen through their local armed groups, but instead they just want to hide behind them. Iran, they hide behind Houthis. Saudi Arabia, they hide behind the Yemeni government and other armed groups. But they are still there controlling all over Yemen, not only the islands. So it's, I guess it's the first time that Yemenis really don't own their decision. So it is true, and it's true, but it's sad that if someone wants to talk to Houthis, they should go through Iran and Oman. And if someone wants to talk to STC, it should be through the United Arab Emirates. And if we want to talk to the government, it will be through Saudi Arabia. They will do nothing without going back to their, I don't know what to call them. So this is that made the war in Yemen much very complicated. If Yemenis are still owing their decision, then maybe ending the war will be much easier. But while trying to end the war in Yemen and push for peace process, a sustainable peace, we should be aware that these regional powers are intervening in Yemen, and they're still doing a lot in Yemen, but in a different way. It's not airstrikes, but they are still there. So Iran, within the time, their intervention is more clear that now I'm in Sana'a, and the Iranian ambassador is here in Sana'a. I got stuck outside Yemen for 1 year and 10 months. I couldn't go back. I couldn't use the UN house until I was let to use it by Saudis. But the Saudi ambassador, he's here in Sana'a. I don't know how he arrived. He was let to be here. So since the beginning of the war, this war was not meant to defeat Houthis. Houthis, it was just to make them stronger in the areas that is designed for them to be stronger. They were kicked out from all the southern governorates, but they were not kicked out from other governorates. At the beginning, they didn't have drones, they didn't have missiles, but now they do. They are getting stronger in the areas that they are controlling. That's why I said whoever designed this war, I don't know what the US or the UK want from Yemen, but whoever designed this war decided in order to divide Yemen between different armed groups and to make them as a de facto. Any peace effort that cannot end this and bring us to the idea of a state that is based on the rule of law and democracy, it just means that the war in Yemen didn't end. And it's the seriousness of the US to end the war will, as I said, will appear. But I don't know if the counterterrorism is an issue, because the perfect environment for any fanatic groups is to divide a country between different armed groups. The Qaeda was never having this space in the very populated areas as it happened since the beginning of this war. So it's not, if they really care about the Qaeda and counterterrorism, then dividing Yemen between armed groups is not the solution. And they know this. I don't know what do they want, but I know what do we want and what we can push for. And Yemen meant to be ignored. And it was in the top of the priorities of the new US administration because of the very good work of civil society, internally and internationally. So I believe that civil society and individuals and media platform can still push the United States to do its role that helps Yemen to go out of this rubbish, even if they don't want to.
Thank you so much, Radhya. Then that leads me to my last question for both Annelle and Bruce. And it's partly inspired by Robert Naiman, who in the chat asks, that in the past, Democrats in Congress, as well as Republicans, were pushing very hard to get the war ended. But once the Biden administration came in, it seems to have been a shift towards a bit more of a deferential position towards the Biden administration, trusting that they're going to do it because they said they're going to do it, even though, as Bruce pointed out, we haven't seen much. Now, we also seen that Senator Warren has taken leadership on this issue as well, sent a letter on May 20th asking for what do you think would be the breaking point for congressional Democrats to stop being deferential to the Biden administration and do what they did earlier on, which was to push to make sure that the Biden administration lives up to its commitments and its word on this issue, to end the war, to end the blockade, and end arms sales in a more meaningful way. I'm going to start off with you, Bruce, and then go to Annelle.
I can say from talking to people that there is frustration, that they haven't seen very much activity. That the administration seems to condemn every Houthi malfeasance and rarely speaks out about the Saudis and never speaks out about the Emiratis. I think that is this quiescence, relative quiescence from the Hill, is not likely to endure. The Hill is going on leave soon, unless the Democrats make a decision not to. My guess would be to come back in the fall if there hasn't been some tangible improvement on the ground. We're going to start seeing more and more unrest, starting with the squad, and then moving to a broader audience. Certainly they should. Joe Biden shouldn't get a pass on this. He said this was a major priority. Let's see the administration put the means behind it. I want to say one last thing about the Houthis. The Houthis, for all their fire and drama, and for all their extremely negative views about the United States and Israel, as far as I know, there's not a single piece of evidence of the Houthis ever targeting Americans outside of Yemen or of ever targeting Israel. So yes, reprehensible in many, many ways, but as a direct threat to the United States of America, I don't see much evidence of that. Now, the Biden administration was smart to repeal the foreign designated application against the Houthis early on. But that designation should never have happened in the first place.
Thank you, Bruce. And now, last word is to you.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of this has to do with partisanship, that under Trump, there was such outcry after the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and Yemen, the issue of Yemen also got bound up in that, and there was a lot of anger from many Americans. That wasn't partisan. There was just shock and horror at what the Saudis were doing in Yemen against Khashoggi in general. And so they coalesced this movement because the Trump administration had been so close to the Saudis and was so willing to give them a pass on so many issues. And so it became this cudgel with which usually Democrats on the Hill could beat the Trump administration. And yet now that we have Biden in charge, we are seeing a lot more deference, as Trita, you mentioned, as Bruce was saying. And I think the issue here goes right back to what Radhya was saying, which was the need for civil society groups to emphasize this, to continue to say, look, you don't just get to use the Yemen war as a useful cudgel to beat Trump. This is something that Americans care about. And what we've seen pressure in the past working, I think at this point, Biden has put himself in a potentially awkward situation because he did highlight this and he did say that US policy was going to change, and we haven't seen that. And so if Americans come out and call their representative in Congress and call the Biden administration and just make abundantly clear that people do care about this issue and that the Biden administration and Congress don't get to simply kind of wash their hands of it, because as Radhya was saying, things have not gotten better. The crisis continues in Yemen. Nothing has improved there. And it is simply unacceptable for the Biden administration to pretend that they have shifted their stance on this when they have not.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think it will be very interesting to see in the next couple of weeks and months how this issue further develops. I would tend to believe that you're quite right, because the tensions and anger is growing, and at some point a breaking point will be reached in which, simply because of US national interest, there will be a major push to get the United States out of this war, and hopefully a strong push for diplomacy to make sure that the conflict as a whole, not just the US's involvement in it, can be resolved. I want to thank all of you for a fantastic conversation. Unfortunately, somewhat depressing, but given the topic, that should not be very surprising, but very, very illuminating. And hopefully there will be that window of opportunity to get this resolved will be much longer than the couple of weeks that Bruce predicted. For all of you who have participated as well, I want to thank you all for being part of this conversation, for asking excellent questions in the chat. And if you haven't already, please go to quincyins.org, sign up for the Quincy Institute's mailing list so that you will be able to receive notifications of all of our different webinars, as well as our publications and op-eds on a variety of issues, including, of course, Yemen. But for now, thank you so much, and hope to see you next time. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Radhya and Annelle. This was an excellent conversation. I hope we can count on you to perhaps revisit after the summer and see if there is new momentum for making positive change here.
Inshallah.
I think that's an excellent idea. Come September.
Very good. Excellent.
Thanks so much for being with us, Radhya, especially in the evening and all the way from Sana'a. Really great to have you with us.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.